Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. I want to pause for a second and savor that sentence. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. What is truly exceptional about this sentence is that it contains the only explicitly feminine form of the word disciple. Now, this doesn't come across in English because we don't have gendered words for disciples. Greek really doesn't either normally, even though we know that there were many disciples who also happened to be women, like Mary Magdalene or Martha, Mary of Bethany, to name just a few. When these women are named, they're named simply as disciples along with all the male disciples, using a masculine word for disciple. But here in Acts, for the first and the last time in the Bible, we hear a different word, mathetria, a woman and a disciple in one word. Our attention is being drawn not only to Tabitha's discipleship, but very specifically also to her womanhood. Then we're told what a wonderful, exemplary disciple she is. The English sentence, she was devoted to good works and acts of charity, again, does not do justice to the Greek here. The Greek says she is literally overflowing or full to the brim with all these acts of compassion. So we're given a picture of an ideal follower of Christ. And we're given no way to ignore what our patriarchal norms might lead us to gloss over. This picture of an ideal disciple is also a picture of a woman. Now, we're not told immediately what sorts of good works she is overflowing with. Instead, we hear simply that she began to waste away and then died. But when the mourners gather, we begin to understand where her ministry was focused, on caring for widows. She made clothes not only for them, but with them by her own hand. Now, this requires some explanation. Throughout the Bible, there are three categories of people specially singled out as needing support: widows, orphans, and migrants. Orphans probably make sense to us. They don't have parents to take care of them. And the need of migrants for compassion is pretty obvious to most of us as well. But why widows in particular? Now, of course, to lose a loved one is tragic and deserves our compassion, but then why single widows out from all those who have lost someone close to them? Now, you may already know or have guessed the answer. Widows are singled out because in a society that values women primarily on the basis of the men they are attached to, a woman who has lost her attachment to a man is singularly vulnerable to being discarded by that society. Realizing this is the only way we can make sense of how some ancient documents distinguish between a true widow and one who is a widow in name only. In other words, a true widow is a woman in their thinking whose husband died and there was no other man to replace him. This is presumably why Mary is never referred to as a widow. Joseph is clearly gone by the time Jesus begins his ministry. But Jesus is an adult by then, so Mary is still attached through motherhood to an adult male. This is also the explanation for why in John's gospel, Jesus's last act before death is to give his mother to the beloved disciple by saying, "Woman, here is your son," and then to the disciple, "Here is your mother." So Mary is not a real widow because she always has an adult male relative to provide her an anchor in this very patriarchal society. A woman without this good fortune, though, was considered a real widow because she was left undefended from the fallout of these patriarchal ideas. So the upshot of this is that widows are singled out in the Bible as needing special support because they are marginalized in any society that only values women for their usefulness to male concerns. If there is no male in these societies who sees a woman's value, she is shut out from full participation in it. Such a domination society alienates any person who does not serve the interests of the dominant group, alienates them from any value they might have apart from the dominant group's interests. It's on the basis of this alienation that the powerful in these societies are able to claim ownership and control over what was never theirs to begin with, and indeed can't ever truly be theirs except by theft, violence, trickery, or legal fiction. And this week, we were again painfully reminded of what we probably already knew, which is that we live in just such a society. How else can we explain a dominant culture that imagines that by clever legal manipulation and disingenuity, or failing that by outright thievery and violence, it can take whatever it wants from anyone who is not a member of the dominant group? Whether the thing it takes is land or wealth or control of our very bodies, it demands that any of us who are not lucky enough to fit a certain type, and yes, I tend to fit that type, but any of us who are not lucky enough to fit a certain type give up all that they have, even their bodies, so that those in power can use them for their own interests and their own benefit. This process begins maybe by patronizing and condescending, suggesting that you're not good enough or wise enough or strong enough or clever enough to have that autonomy over yourself. But if that fails, trickery may follow. Sign here and ignore that small print, and we'll give you 100 sacks of grain for a real bargain. All we ask in return is your land and the land of your ancestors. Finally, if all of that fails, the trickery and the condescension, violence settles it. And of course, sometimes we skip straight to that step. The people in power in this society and every other domination society might as well declare openly. They might as well say, we will beat, torture, or kill to make sure you stay in your place and we get to stay in ours, which is, of course, above you. They declare, if you want to use what God has given us all, or even what God has given uniquely to you and no other, which is to say your body, if you wish to use that for something that the powerful don't approve of, whether it's getting pregnant or remaining pregnant or ending a pregnancy, whether it's making love to someone of the same gender or someone of a different race, or worse, marrying someone who is either or both, or whether it is expressing a gender other than the one that was chosen for you before you were even consulted. In every case, this society will do what it can to stop you, even if the end result is your death. This is a culture of power, a culture of domination, and it's a culture of death. This is not the world or the society I want. In fact, I don't know how anyone can really want it if they examine it more closely. And so, well, as a straight, cisgender white man, I may have a ticket to ride this domination train, albeit maybe a second-class ticket. I have no interest in going where it's headed. Where it's headed leaves most of the world, and thus most of the people I love, hurt, broken, used. And it leaves all of us, finally, dead. I don't want to go there, and I hope you don't either. So I hope you'll marvel with me in recognizing that God has said no to this nightmare. That God has risked everything, has even given God's own self up to death on a cross to deny that nightmare any possibility of coming to pass in the end. God has promised not only that there is another way, but that if we follow, God will take us there. And today, God shows us the way in this story of Tabitha, like a time-worn signpost pointing to freedom. Now, it took me some time to find this signpost, though. I didn't see it until a friend of mine, who happens to be a woman and a mother and a priest and a saint, pointed it out to me. And someone else had pointed it out to her already. Someone who happens to be Black and a pastor and a saint. If domination culture had had its way, I would never have heard them. And I would never have seen this hope. So thank God for them, and for Tabitha, and for all the saints, and for this other way. Here's the hope that they showed me. In the words of the Reverend Dr. Willie James Jennings. In his commentary on this passage in Acts, he writes this: "Here glory joins strong grief, because to lose someone who cares for the weak and vulnerable, whose life is turned toward making a difference in the world, and who is making a difference, is a bitter loss. The widows have lost Tabitha, and the disciple is gone. This is what Peter steps into in Joppa. Peter's presence declares, though, an unmistakable truth. Women matter. This woman matters. And the work she does matters to God. It matters so much that God will not allow death the last word. Others had been raised from the dead in the Gospels and in Luke's Gospel. But this is different. This is not a little girl or the brother of a friend of Jesus. This is a disciple raised from the dead. Tabitha is not finished in life or service. Tabitha, get up. Peter repeats Jesus. Tabitha is an activist who lives again in resurrection power. Her body has been quickened by the Spirit, and her eyes are opened again to see a new day. She has work to do and joy to give to the widows. You have not been abandoned, dear widows. God has heard your weeping and returned her to you. And more importantly, she is alive. We know that death imagines a special claim to the bodies of women. Their deaths are normalized and naturalized in social orders that value men's bodies far above all others. It will not be so among the disciples. They will find Peter standing next to Tabitha, a gift of God who has been given again the gift of life. It is no accident that the first disciple to have this little taste of the resurrection is a woman, because it was a woman who gave birth to the resurrection. My siblings, we're faced today with a false use. And not just today, but through all the days of our past, we've been faced with a false use, or rather an abuse of the Jesus movement. One that claims that it is God's will, that it is righteous to deny women life and to deny them autonomy over their lives in order to protect potential male offspring, even male offspring that don't exist yet. So we followers of Christ, we must stand up and deny that this is God's will. The real Jesus movement is the movement that gives women, all women, with or without wombs, or husbands, or male relatives, and yes, gives trans and non-binary folks, Black folks and Indigenous folks, and the disabled and the elderly and children and everyone else who has ever had a domination society hold a contest for whether they count, whether you have a right to your own body. The real Jesus movement is the one that gives every one of you your bodies back as a holy temple of God's image, of which you are the sole curator. Period. Full stop. And this movement of the Spirit gives us all our bodies back, not by passing new laws that threaten violence or domination to someone else, nor by finding someone else in another nation or people to bear the cost of this liberation. No, it gives us back our bodies, not by power of principality, not by using rules, but by breaking the rules. The very rules of physics, of biology, the very laws that God put in place. And if you're willing to believe that God put any laws in place, you got to start with these ones upon which existence itself seems to depend. But by breaking those laws to restore a woman's body to life, to her life, God seems to me to declare to us today, no law, no matter how strict, not even the law of the impermanence of life itself, can forever sever a person from their body. That's the hope of the resurrection of the body, that as broken as this world may insist on continuing to be, we will all one day get our bodies back. So if you still have control of yours, that's wonderful. I do too, for now. So let's use them while we can. Let's use them to join the Spirit in this movement that will one day give everyone their bodies back. Amen.